Hi everyone, this is Allan McKay and welcome to Video4. We're just halfway through this course at this point and we've already done a lot. I'll keep this short, but this video we get heavily into creating a lot of elements, both particle systems, fume effects fluids, and bringing everything we've learned together so we create a massive multi-layered effect, creating an epic shockwave that's built both of sparks, ash, and of course layered elements of fluids. This is a critical element that not only gives the entire shot the impact element it needs after everything that we've created so far, but it's also the element that fully immerses the camera and creates a sense of being inside of the effect. There's lots to do, so let's dive in. Okay, in this lesson we're actually going to build a lot of different elements. We're not just going to build one specific one. We're going to be building out, I guess 4 is what I have in mind. We'll see how many, but I think 3 or 4. They'll all be rendered together, but I'll also show how to extract all of that out again. So, in the situation, like right now we have like our orb effects, we have the fringe, and then we have like this particle pulse element, and they're all building up in the first half of our shot, and then they kind of explode and expand, and they, create something like that. Now, what's really missing is like these are all kind of older elements that are all expanding out. I want to have something that really has that impact, that really big hit, have like a shockwave that hits the camera, something that kind of fills up the void. Because what I want to have is that once this thing explodes, the camera's inside of it, and like everything is very ethereal, everything's kind of moving around. I want to have like kind of ash or sparks or something kind of like floating through the air. Just really feel like before, when you're in the shot, you're in this negative space, and there's this kind of contained effect. And as that explodes, disperses, like the whole thing, like at that point, it's expanded as far as it can. It's very high pressure. So at that point of exploding, you're now inside of it, okay? And you're kind of dealing with the turbulence of being in there, okay? If that makes sense. So for that to happen, we really need it to, first of all, hit the beat of like having that impact, like really rip apart very violently, and really kind of hit that beat. But then on top of that, once that's happened, I want to have everything kind of moving inside of it and have like a very fluidy kind of motion to it, and of course have a lot of particulate matter. I want it to feel like there's no negative space, like there's nothing. Like right now this is empty space, then it's kind of like we're underwater, we're inside of it. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. I'm trying to give an idea of the direction I want to take this. To pull that off, what we're going to be doing is 2 different things. I want to first of all create like a fluid simulation, like fume effects that expands out, very similar to our fog and everything else at the very beginning. But as that happens, like I want this to kind of be 2 elements. One is a shockwave, so something that really hits the camera, and another one that's more filling the void. So in other words, something that's in the air, it's more expanding and doing everything. Now, in addition to that, I mentioned in the very beginning of video 1 that I don't want to do like heavy simulations. I want to make the right decisions in the right places to get this done. So I'm going to do 2 fume effect simulations, but I don't want these to fill up the entire space and simulate like a massive area, because that is going to be a very lengthy sim. And more importantly, I want to be able to get the timing, the feel, everything about it correct early on, as well as to match the timing of the rest of the other controls that we have in the shot. So the way I imagine it is that we're going to do a simulation of the shockwave, as well as it kind of filling up the air, but we're going to have it all kind of in a controlled space and get it as detailed as we can. But then we're going to use that and link it all to the master sphere, so that way it mimics that timing, and it also can expand because we can have it then the cache expand out very quickly and hit the camera. And I think that that's going to work very effectively. as well as keeping the simulation times down and everything else that we are aiming to have. Okay, so now that I've explained the hell out of this, let's actually go do it. Going in here, I'm just going to create a new layer, and we'll just call this Shockwave, I guess. And in there, there's a few different ways to do this. I'm actually going to just go into Particle Systems, PF Source, change this to a circle, and let's just zoom in and drag out a circle here. So on top of that, let's hide pulse. Let's just stay in this one. One interesting thing is when you're creating from the top viewport, it's going to fire it downward, which is kind of annoying. So I want to rotate that 180 degrees. And loading up particle flow. I'm going to rename this to PFS Shockwave. Now, with this event, a couple of things. Let's make this 100%, max it out at that limit. Let's wait for this to autosave. Come on. Okay, I'm going to set it to about 57. I figured that's about the radius that I wanted to go with. And the whole idea is that I want this to shoot outward. Okay? So to do that, let's just go to speed. And I'm going to choose center out. And that way these particles are all shooting out like that. So there's not too much more I want to do. I'm going to get rid of the shapes because we're going to use this for fume effects. So the whole idea is I want to use this as a fume effects emitter, so I don't really need much. I do need to keep the lifespan short, so I'm just going to, I don't know, do like 4 and 1. So it's literally just doing that, okay? Now in terms of timing, because I think that's like a really critical thing here, let's bring up the volume sphere. So it really gets violent around 120. So there's a bit of build up, but it's not until 120 that it really disperses. So I'm going to right click on my play button and let's just change this to 110. So we're just starting the animation at 110. It's just going to make it easier to kind of play with the timing. I'm going to hide that sphere again. But with this, in terms of timing, let's set it to like 120 to 130. So I'm just going to get a quick burst of particles. I think the key thing though is let's just give it like a really big particle number. So what ends up happening is we get these particles shooting out like so. While I'm on the subject of speed, let's just give this like a, I don't know, 25, something like that, just an angle, so that way they're shooting out a little bit more spread. They're not just like a flat disc. The other thing that I want to do is we need it to collide with the ground. Okay, so what might be easier, I think I have that U deflector floating around. Yeah, U deflector bottom. So let's just go in here. I'm gonna do a collision, click add, and choose that U deflector bottom. Now let's also make sure these particles are sitting above the surface. Now at frame 120, all these particles are going to be colliding with the ground. Okay, so it just makes it a bit more interesting. Again, nothing fancy, but it just gives us something interesting to start with. Finally, I do want to make this a bit more elegant, so let's spawn some trails. And these trails, I'm going to make them live forever. I'm going to have them collide with the ground. I will introduce some drag. So again, making sure that This is the active layer. I'm going to drop in a drag and a wind. It doesn't matter where they're positioned, I'm just trying to move them into a place that's tidy. But initially, let's just set the strength to 0 on the wind for the moment, and the drag, we'll give it an infinite value of 5, but going forever, and we'll add these in. Now, what I mostly want to do here is I'm going to set these to travel by distance, and I'm using these, which don't live very long, to spawn a lot of particles that are shooting out. These are going to move very quickly, so there's going to be a lot of them. So because of that, the step size should probably be a pretty high value. The main thing is that I want these to trail behind. Let's make these a bit easier to see. I'm going to turn off the display of the other guys, the heads of them. And so with these though, I want them to spawn a lot of particles. I want these to be fairly spread out. But don't worry about the divergence as much. So the whole idea is, let's switch to the camera view. What we're going to see is just lots of particles, and this is what fume's going to emit. Okay, so we could even change this to Shockwave FFX for fume effects, and it's just signaling that this is the event that I'm actually going to have fume effects emit. So these collide with the ground. They've got drag on them, so they don't go too crazy. They have wind, which we're not using right now. The main thing is that they shoot out and they've got a little bit of drag and things like that applied. So I guess the other thing is, let's give this a little bit of wind. Mostly, I just want it to go up in the air a little bit, because again, it is fluids. And I don't know, 0.01, can't really, okay. Yeah, 0.05. Yeah, that's good. Okay, so all I'm doing is I'm just trying to get a little bit of more intricate motion from it. But the whole idea is that now we've got something kind of crazy, but just particles shooting out and sweeping along the ground, a bit of turbulence, things like that. And I'm also going to go back and change this to 125. So we're just going to emit for a couple of frames. So 5 frames. And at this point we can introduce some lifespan. I think I'm just going to do this. In fact, I'm just going to drag and drop. So that there is just going to give us a burst. I'm not sure if I wouldn't mind. I kind of like the idea of this stuff just living forever. But again, we got to think about how much space it's going to take up. So having a lifespan to it just means that we have particles live for a little bit. I think that's probably a good starting point with this. I mean, it's not that difficult to do something like this. I've done it so many damn times. But the point of it is that you're getting something that just has a pretty interesting motion to it. And this could be something that kind of fills the void pretty quickly. So with Shockwave still the key layer active, I'm just saving really quick, but I'm just going to load up Fume. Drag this in the viewport, and I'm just gonna set the dimensions up. Now, I'm just going to name this before I forget, so I'm just going to call this ground Shockwave. Okay, and yeah, I mean, all I've done is I just set this up where, if we look at the camera, that's where my camera is, and that's why I decided to pause it, just to do this really quick. But the camera is there, so that's what the camera is viewing. If you select the camera, you can say Show Cone, and that's all I'm doing. I'm just permanently seeing what its field of view is. And that helps me because I know that typically this is all that I'm going to see. So I don't mind it clipping a little bit at the back, and as it expands out, you're really just going to see it going forward. You're not going to see it doing anything else. So at this point, you know, I've just orientated it slightly to go down here as well, you know, just stuff like that. So I just expanded out to be the field of view, and I rotated it slightly there to aim down because the garage is going on a slant. Now, going into Fume, let's set this up. Again, I got a tool to help with that. Resolution. So one common thing that happens a lot when I'm doing live reviews with students is that I say, like, what's your grid resolution? And they say it's 3.585. In other words, they're looking at this value. This means nothing because ultimately it could be 100, it could be 0.001. It really depends on the scene scale and a lot of other things. So really, it's not going to help much. Your resolution is down here. Just treat this like a multiplier, okay? So in other words, I bring it down, it's shrinking everything to fit in more cells into a grid. So I want to bring this down enough that I'm getting a resolution that typically the way that I see it is that the lowest resolution I want no less than 150. So probably starting with like 0.7 around there. You know, that will do for now. It's a little low resolution, but it'll be a good starting point. Now, the big thing is object source. Let's just create a particle source and pick our emitter. And it's going to pop up saying, what do you want to do? And because we labeled this, I know the Shockwave FFX is what I want. Now you can see that the yellow circles around it, which means that it's working because we can turn that on and off. And this is representing the radius. Okay. So just a heads up with Fume, the way this works is that typically the general tab, simulation tab, and object source, these ones here, and of course wavelet as well, but these ones here are the ones that if you change these, you need to simulate it to see a result. Whereas illumination and rendering, this is really your shader and lighting. So these you can do in real time. Anything you adjust in there, typically you're not going to need to resim. Typically, there's a few things like fluid mapping, stuff like that. But yeah, so you know, if I change any value in here, I'm not going to see anything until I sim it. If I change anything in the simulation, same deal. The general tab is more the properties of the box, like the dimensions, the resolution, what's displaying in there, stuff like that. So that's the quickest way to break this stuff down. But what I'm going to go for, I think that's, you know, I think that looks pretty good overall. I think the key thing is going to be the velocity multiplier. I want this to be about half. In other words, I want it to trail behind with some momentum. The other thing is that I want this to fall down a little bit. So having a negative temperature, in other words, if the temperature is below 0, typically smoke is going to fall because it's cool. It's kind of like if you go into a meat freezer or you know, you see dried ice, that sort of thing. Like you'll see it all kind of goes down. Whereas if it's hot, like steam, it's going to go up. And that's how the temperature buoyancy works. It also means that below 0, or whatever the initial burn rate is, fuel won't burn. But we're not using any fuel for this. This is strictly just a smoke, dirt kind of combination. So I haven't done anything here other than I brought my radius up and I made my velocity multiplier. In other words, the velocity the fluid is emitting out at half of what the particles are doing. So the particle might be moving really quick. It means it's going to drag a trail behind a fluid that's kind of moving in the same direction, but it's only at half the speed. And then finally, the temperature, I set to -25. So if I have fluid go up in the air, it's going to drift down a little bit. It's going to be more like dirt rather than smoke. It really drives me nuts when I have effects artists and they do like a dirt explosion and then the dirt kind of rises up in the air because they're treating with the default settings, which is smoke or steam, and it's not what we're going for. We want something that has a little bit of weight, so it's going to tend to fall back down a little bit with gravity. So that's it, just those 3 values there. Beyond that, I'm just going to throw in some like random settings. Again, it's just auto-saving. The LiDAR information makes it save a little bit slow. I'm just going to throw in some random settings, so you know, you can mimic these if you want. these are just things I typically would just throw in. So giving it a little bit of turbulence. I'm making the turbulence quite small. I'm making it phase a little bit quicker because I want it to be violent. I'm always going to put my detail up to 5 unless there's a reason not to. A little bit of turbulence, just something to kind of get it going. Turning fuel off. So that's pretty much it. I'm just going to throw some stuff in there. I don't want fuel, so turn that checkbox for fuel off. That way we're just simulating smoke and nothing else. I put the timescale up so it reacts a bit quicker because this is obviously a very quick burst. And yeah, just a bit of turbulence and it's small scale turbulence. That's it. So I'm going to run a simulation really quick and let's just see how it looks. The last thing, if we go to object source, I'm just going to hide the yellow circles. They tend to draw a little bit slower, so I just figure it'd be good to get rid of them. Okay, so again, just to recap, radius of 3, negative 25 for temperature, 0.5 for velocity multiplier. I explained all of that. I gave it a little bit of turbulence, set the scale and stuff like that of the turbulence a little bit lower, and then I put the time scale up a little bit so it reacts a bit quicker. That's it. I'm going to run a sim, and yeah, I just want to get a general idea of how it's looking. So hit sim. Also, one other thing, if you ever run your simulation and you're like, okay, there it is, and then it disappears, like where to go? Go to your general tab and just check this out. So here you have what frames to sim. So 110 to 238. Okay, so that's correct. If I go down here, it's saying the cache, like a video. Let's say you rented out an image sequence. It's saying when do you want to play it? It's saying to use 110 to 238, but it's saying to play it from frame 0, which is wrong. So it's just good to check that and make sure these are synced, because otherwise when you go to frame 0, it's going to start playing the cache instead of the frame that it started simulating at. Okay, so that's just something I figured I'd mention really quick. Now, while this is simming, I'm going to go to the rendering tab. It defaults to white, which is kind of a little bit annoying. So I just right-clicked and chose keyless mode. I'm just going to do a gray, make it a little bit brown. I'll worry about the colors later. I just want to throw something in there that's just a bit more interesting than what we had. Now, I'll let the sim for a few minutes and let's just check it out. But, I mean, overall, this is going to do what I expect, which is lots of particles. They shoot out in a radius. I think I'm going to need to give it a lot of turbulence and animate the turbulence down over time. I think I'll play with, the shader a little bit. But overall, I think that the particles are going to be fine. The emission is going to be fine. All of that is doing what it needs to. If you look at the camera view, I mean, that looks cool. If it was to come at the camera much faster, definitely needs more resolution. But then if we look above that, I want there to be something in the air as well. I want there to be the leading edge of the Shockwave, but I want there to be kind of like something kind of expanding in the air as well. So those two things should play hand in hand. Okay? So I'll let it sim for a little bit. So I've only simmed for 2 minutes, okay? Like, not very long at all, but it's giving me enough information that I can kind of get an idea of like what's going on, what I want to do. And I kind of mentioned this earlier that when it comes to rendering, usually I can get something finalized within a few takes, depending. Obviously I've had projects that I've gotten to version 200 and something, but what I mean by that is that I need to be able to see something to then be able to guess what the next thing I need to do is. And in this case, just looking at this for 2 minutes, it's enough to say, okay, the simulation's great there. It begins to thin out very quickly because the particles aren't there anymore. I know that from that range of the cone of the camera, this is all that I'm going to see. So I don't mind getting my particles and having these live forever. In other words, continue to pump out fluid the entire time, because it is going to clip, and that's something that is a concern, but it's all going to be out of range. Like I've moved the grid far enough back that it's never going to clip unless it's encapsulating the camera, and later I want to expand this whole thing out. So I think that given the dimensions of this grid and where the camera is, I can keep these particles just pushing more fluid out the entire time, and we're not going to get any of that breakdown, because I can already tell that the fluid will be pretty much gone by the end of the shot. And instead I want this to be something that is really violent. In addition to that, I'd say I want to give us a lot of turbulence, because this is moving so quickly. Okay, so a lot of turbulence, a lot of vorticity, and vorticity is just going to help break it up. It's more kind of just the eddies, just the internal kind of, yeah, like eddies essentially that's going on in the shot. The other thing is that it looks a little bit weak from this angle, and that's because when it hits the ground, it's just going out of the grid, okay? So what I want to do is, if I set the z-axis for blocking sides to negative z, in other words, down, because positive z is up and negative z is down. If I set that, it's saying now the grid is going to be a collision object. And remember, I aligned this, I rotated it down a little bit so it's aligned with the surface. It's slightly above, but it's aligned with the surface. So now this is going to be treated as a ground object, and the particles are already colliding with it, so I don't need to worry about them. I think that those two things will work really well. Besides that, I am going to up the timescale a little bit, and that's mainly to do with knowing how quick the particles shoot out. I want these to be very reactive. I want these to be able to keep up with it. So putting the timescale up that high, though, it's too quick per frame. And I know I'm firing out a lot of information right now. Hopefully it's not too much. But my fluid is moving very quickly. And so the timescale allows it to keep up and react at that speed. However, it's too much per frame. And this happens a lot. Like, people do these really quick simulations and they wonder why there's streaking, popping, all these weird issues happening. And it's because it's too much to calculate between one frame and the next. So what we want to do is we want to set this to have a max simulation step of 2, meaning that if it gets too fast, it's going to simulate twice per frame. In other words, frame 128, and then the next frame would be 128.5. In other words, it'll potentially do 2 samples per frame. So that's all I'm doing, is because my timescale is so high, I want my simulation steps to be a little bit higher. In other words, be able to simulate twice per frame if it needs to. And the way that it decides whether or not it needs to is based on how much a fluid will move from one cell to the next. Okay, so just to really complicate things, if I go down the bottom here, we go voxel XY, I can zoom right in. It's very hard to see. There we go. So these little grids represent the voxels, okay? So just like the dimensions here, this is how many that can fit. So if it moves more than 5 voxels in one frame, it's going to that's how it's going to figure out like whether or not to simulate twice, and that's based on the CFL condition. So in other words, I can have this simulate twice per frame. I can have it simulate 100 times or 99 if I need to, but it's all going to be based on how much it travels, and the CFL condition allows me to do that. So in other words, I want this to be able to have the option to simulate more times if it needs to, if the fluid is moving too quickly, usually at the very beginning when the particles are emitting out, before they begin to slow down. That's where it might need to simulate twice. But I use the CFL condition to say it needs to actually move about 10 of these to do it. So in other words, it's only when it's really explosive, really quick, that it's going to need to do that. Okay, so bring the CFL condition up. It's going to mean it's going to be less sensitive to needing it, but it does have the option if there is some like excessively fast moving fluid anywhere. Finally, turning on the cubic interpolation. I used this earlier as well, and it's just a better way to sample a lot of the more intricate layers that kind of typically it wouldn't prioritize. So in other words, like lower density areas, instead of like culling it and getting rid of it or dulling it down, it's actually going to continue to allow that stuff to sample is you get like a lot of really low velocity motion being calculated. In other words, you get a lot of nice curls and things like that. So it will slow down the simulation. If your sims are slow, turn this off. But this is a way for me to kind of get some more intricate motion from what I'm doing. So that's just definitely something I'll do. I'm going to set my scale a bit lower. Everything else I think is fine. So I mean, it's mostly just sampling more times. Time scale plays a big factor. Lots of turbulence. This is going to move around a lot. It's really going to pull it apart. But that's why I'm sampling twice per frame. And then, yeah, I mean, colliding with the ground, I think that's important. Overall, I don't think there's much else I'd want to do. I might set my smoke dissipation strength low, 0.8, so that way the smoke doesn't dissipate as much. But that's it. Like, I'm pretty, like, already within 2 minutes I can tell like what I need to do. And the only things I did is I made it more reactive, more turbulent. I made particles emit for longer, which I might regret, we'll see. But I think that having the particles there is just going to avoid all that negative space, because I can see it starting to break down. So having all the particles on the entire time, I think that's just going to continue to put out fluid. And then, yeah, just having it really violent, colliding with the ground, and sampling enough, knowing that that's going to give it a lot of the internal detail that I want as it's coming towards the camera. So I did it kind of quick, but I can tell already that I think this is going to work really well. So I'll run a sim of this, and I'm going to increase the detail. I want this to be fairly high res, so I'm going to try that. And yeah, let's take a look at how it turns out. Okay, so I ran the sim, and a couple of things. So for now, I'm pretty happy with this. I want to say use NSIM, and the reason I'm doing that is purely because I'm more just mentioning this, but I use NSIM, just turning that on when you haven't set any of this up. All it's doing is it's protecting me from overriding my cache. So I just figured I'd kind of throw that in there, but it's just a handy way that, let's say that you are happy with your sim and you're going to hand it off to lighting, and you don't want them to accidentally hit sim or something, because I see it all the time. People do that and it completely screws you up. And the worst part is that when they've brought that asset into a brand new empty scene, it's going to write out an empty cache, and it's going to do it in like 5 seconds because it's got nothing to calculate. And I've seen it where someone actually hits it just because they're nervous and just kind of like clicking around for fun, and then minutes later you see the whole entire render farm that was referring to that dust cache or whatever it was, suddenly everything goes blank and all your rendered frames, everything is destroyed. So then you got to resim it, which could take days, and you know. So I just figured I'd mention that, but like it's just handy because I can't click sim while I have that enabled, so it's just a good kind of precaution. So this is all looking okay from what I can tell. I'm going to change this to use GPU, and then view shadows. Finally, I'm going to go to rendering and enable to cast receive shadows, and then turn my particles off. And I'm just doing that so the GPU is going to draw faster, and it's just, you know, having shadows on it just looks a bit more interesting. So that's it. I'll do a quick preview of this, not from the camera, but just so we can take a look at it out of context and see how it looks. So 110 to 238. So I only did about 50% of the preview and I stopped it, but you get the idea. And you can see that that came together really quickly because I did most of it through the particles. I did quick low-res sims so I could get an idea of like, okay, how's it reacting? And then from there, I knew right away to keep particles around for longer, make it collide with the ground, bring up the time scale so that way it is able to react faster, crank up the turbulence because I need to compensate for how quickly everything's moving, sample, you know, twice per frame to keep up with everything, cubic interpolation, so I get a lot of the intricate kind of swirls and everything. You know, just in general, from experience, I'm able to kind of make those calls based on, you know, pretty simple setup. and be able to know what kind of result I'm going to get. So overall, I think that works really well. If I were to switch to this view, we could take a look. But I mean, the preview isn't going to give us the most accurate look when it comes to something like this. But, you know, for the most part, I know that this is doing what it needs to. It's got this big shockwave that's rolling towards you. We're going to animate it expanding out, so it's going to be like 3 or 4 frames and then it's going to hit. So I think that this is working really well. In terms of the shader, things like that, I mean, I think having something that's kind of gray, you know, something like that I think would be totally fine. I think the big thing is to keep it kind of transparent, and this is going to give it some slight fall off. Don't pay too much attention to the GPU preview. It's not going to be the most accurate, even at the highest details. So, and it's also, keep in mind, that's not the only thing that's going to be around. So for the most part, like, I think that we've got a pretty good setup overall. What I will do though is I'm going to start moving on to the next element, because there's 2. As I mentioned, this is the shockwave, which is going to happen very quickly, and it's more about the other one, the air dust. That's the element that's going to be lingering in the air and doing a lot for us. So that one there I'm more interested in, because that's going to be the thing that is going to fill up the space, and it's still going to have some internal motion that even when it's scaled up and the camera's inside of it, I still want to be able to see all of that. So again, making sure my layer shockwave is active, I'm going to select all of this and I'm going to duplicate it. I could probably just use the same system even. In fact, I might try that. I'm just going to copy this over. So we can, use this shockwave, but let's just rename these. So I'm going to call this shockwave, and I'm going to call this one air dust. And this air dust, all I want it to do is I want it just to have particles kind of just go up in the air. I don't want it to really do that much. So this one here was, actually would have thought I would have used edges, but yeah, I think for this I'm just going to have it emit from the center, and I'm going to have it like spread out in an omnidirection. So let's just turn this one off. So pivot, and then we can have this go all out, or something like that. 90 degrees, that's the key thing here, because I mainly just want there to be particles going in every direction. So display ticks turned on. Alright, so 120. There we go. So I just wanted something like that. In terms of lifespan, I want this to be a bit more random, so let's just do 5, 5. And then finally, let's just throw the drag and wind in here. And that's just to help kind of randomize it just a little bit more. I was kind of hoping for a bit more shape from that, but whatever. I'm going to change the display to lines. So I don't need anything that complicated. I just want something that just bursts, okay? Like that. That to me is great. I'm kind of tempted to, you don't really need to, but let's just say, just to demonstrate it, I just quickly duplicated just the wind, and then I set the influence up. Yeah, unfortunately the scale's a little bit too big, but I just figured that could be something that's going to show how, without even building a new wind, I can make a much stronger one. But I'm happy with this, it's fine. I just need a quick burst. Doesn't need to be anything amazing. Key thing is that I'm going to create a new fume grid. You can hide the old one. Let's just turn that voxel grid stuff off. Give it some kind of resolution to start with. And it's taking a little bit of time here. I just wanted to rotate it again into place. So that way, again, this is going to be more omnidirectional because if we look at the camera, we have a pretty wide scope. So we want to see the entire thing all the way around, not really see any clipping. That's really important. But the other thing is, you know, I want this to collide with the ground again, so I've just orientated it to match roughly where the floor is. So that works out pretty well. Okay, now resolution-wise, we'll keep it there for now. I definitely need to increase it. Now the key thing would be to add the particles. So let's just name these so that way they're named correctly. Okay, air dust. Call this air dust FFX just to make it more obvious. Okay, create a new particle source. Add that particle system, choose the air dust. Key thing about this is that I want these to be larger because it's going to encapsulate a big area. How many particles? There's 3,500, yeah, so yeah, about that. You know, it's about, what, 1.8? Now, the other thing is that this time around, this is more of an explosion. So, I don't want there to be trails behind it. I actually want this to be something that pushes the fluid out. Okay, so I'm going to set the velocity multiplier to 2, and that means that if the particles are moving at, let's say, a velocity of 5, they're going to move at a velocity of 10, because it's 2 times the speed. So in other words, they're going to be shooting forwards the whole entire time. Okay. With the velocity multiplier, we could definitely add some variation, and that means that some are going to move faster, some are going to move slower. That's the general gist of it. Besides that, again, just doing a -25 temperature just means that some of it might kind of relax and fall back down. Again, set the output path. Have it start at frame 110, so we don't need to worry about the offset of the cache. So, I mean, I've done nothing. All I have is particles shooting out. I set the radius to roughly 2. The velocity is shooting out very far. The temperature is -25, so it's just going to fall back down a little bit rather than rise up in the air like steam. In terms of the simulation, it's very similar to what we've already built. So I don't need to worry about any fuel, because it's not going to be a fuel explosion. It's just going to be a big burst of smoke. Give it some turbulence. You know, I'm just going to throw in random values again. Just something to start with. So I mean, it doesn't matter too much, but turbulence to 1. Detail, always put to 5. 1.5 scale for time scale. Just random values. It doesn't really matter at this point. I just want to have a little bit of turbulence, and I know it's going to be fast moving, so I'm putting that value up. The other thing is blocking sides. Let's make it collide with the ground. So that's it. I just want to quickly add those values in. And it's just something, so we got, you know, something to work with, because having no turbulence, knowing this is a fast moving particle system, it doesn't make sense to have like a time scale of 1. So, you know, just cranking up the settings that I know we're going to need to throw something in at some point. It's just a way to kind of get there quicker. Okay, so going to the rendering while this is going, I'm just going to change the color, so right click keyless mode. Let's make it gray. Just to have something again to work with. If we want, yeah, GPU's turned on. Cast receive shadows and view shadows. So there we go. So I mean, all this is doing is just creating like a quick puff of smoke, and that's kind of looking at the camera view, imagining the shockwave around it. This is kind of all we need it to be. We just need something that's going to have some intricate motion. I do feel like the turbulence is a little big right now, if you look at that, because I want this to be kind of high frequency. So going in here, I mean, I'll set my scale to 2. I'll make it phase a bit faster, so a lower frames value. We don't need it to be as turbulent. I think that artists tend to get very happy. I can't think of the right term right now. Kind of trigger happy, or whatever the equivalent would be, where they start adding turbulence to everything, and it's one of the most distracting things, because subtlety with effects, that's where the real challenge is. Like being able to balance something that can be excessive with something that you want to kind of keep in the real world. I think it's really important to learn that balance. I'm gonna, by the way, I'll keep my time scale the same. I'm gonna up this to 2, but the CFL to 10 again, just so that way we have the option of simming twice per frame if we need to. Honestly, I think this is gonna be fine. I just need a puff of dust that's not too crazy moving, and it's more to fill in that negative space. We're gonna scale it all up. So I'm just gonna go for my final settings, I think. I mean, yeah, something like that would be fine. It doesn't need to be too crazy. So again, very similar settings to before, like 0.5 vorticity, cubic. Yeah, I mean, I think overall this is fine. We could go down to smoke dissipation, and again, I might just set that to 0.5. So overall, I don't think there's really much that I want to do. I might bring my buoyancy right down. And so this is a global value for your buoyancy. So in other words, your temperature might be negative 25, but that's based on your buoyancy being 1. And again, this is just a global value. So in other words, now this is 20% of 25, which if I was better at math, that would be 5. Okay, so so this is just like something that you could overall change it for everything if you want to. And it's just my lazy way of messing with that. So I realize I'm plowing through this, but there's so much to do in this lesson that, you know, it might be something you might need to watch a couple of times. I don't expect you to keep up the entire time, but I'm hoping that over time, you know, seeing how similar all this stuff is, you'll get the gist. I mean, this is basically particles exploding. Pretty straightforward. And those are creating fluid. And the fluid needs to have details. So it has turbulence, there's small scale turbulence, has the cubic interpolation, so it's going to sample it enough to get like good motion. But overall, it's not that turbulent, it's not that crazy, it's just filling a space. So that's why I can confidently fire at a sim. And the resolution it is high, but it's not that high. Okay, and that's because I'm confident that it's going to fill up the space, and it'll have a lot of internal motion. We have the other elements we're building, they're all going to fit together and complement each other. So I think that this will work well. I'm going to run the sim, and yeah, let's just take a look and see how it turns out. Okay, again, I'm just going to rename this to Air Shockwave. Yeah, I mean, yeah, having that detail, I mean, just this is one frozen frame, but it looks good. Is this set to auto? Yeah, weird. It should be automatically updating, but anyway. Yeah, so overall this looks good. I think this is going to be perfect. So going back in here, like I said, use nsim, protect yourself. That way I can't click sim, can't override it. I'm happy with that. And now we have 2 fume effects elements. So just for fun, I'm going to enable smoke with a reduction of 3 and click that little plus. That means that even if I deselect it, it'll still show up. And I'll do it the same here. So 3, smoke, plus, and turn off that voxel grid. Alright, so if I just go to a freeze frame, we can see that this is covering a lot. Oops. So I think that's going to work out really well. To push it a little bit further, let's see. I'm just going to go back in here, and this is the Shockwave, sorry, air Shockwave. Yeah, so I'm just going to make that slightly lighter gray. 0.45. I mean, yeah, there's really not much I'm going to do here. The main thing is like lighting. So yeah, I don't have any Omni lights in here right now, so I'm just going to make a new layer, so make sure nothing's selected. We'll call this lights, and it's going to go into lights, standard. I'm not going to use a V-Ray light, it's a standard light, and technically the light's coming from this direction and this direction, but I'm going to create one just kind of more angled here. I just want to get some character lighting going. And I think the key thing is, because I want this to cast shadows, I need this to be in here. So I'm just positioning, I know it's kind of hard to see, but the camera is there. I'm positioning my light here. It's still aimed inside of here. Again, from the top view, I'm just going to go to the modify panel. And I'm just going to adjust this to be a bit wider. In fact, I'm going to make it really wide. Okay, so let's just try like 80 and 70. That'll do. Now, important, I'm going to turn on shadows. I don't really think it needs it, but shadows, V-Ray shadow map. And then finally, shadow parameters. This is important because it always gets overlooked. Atmosphere shadows. Turn that on, otherwise your Fume Effects shadows will not work. Okay, whenever they're not working, check that your shadows on V-Ray shadow map or V-Ray shadow, because you're in V-Ray, and then atmosphere shadows, because this communicates with your Fume Effects renderer, which is this guy here, to render lights. So, or calculate the shadows. So go to illumination for both of these grids, and let's just add this light in. Okay, so by doing that now, we've got these two fluids. I'm going to turn these displays off. I just wanted to showcase that for a second. So just going back in here, I'm going to turn enable display off on both of these. I mean, overall, I think it's looking pretty cool. And then the next step is to actually scale these up. So that's going to be interesting. Okay, so at this point, we've got these two containers, and what I want to do next is I actually want them to expand out. Okay, I want these to actually encapsulate the entire camera and to do it very quickly. So as I mentioned, I think it was video 1, the decisions I'm doing with this are to do a practicality. I feel like there's a lot of times effects people will try and take the most complicated route for no reason other than they think that it's more intelligent to do that. And so in this case, if you have like a shockwave that's going to take like 3 seconds to do it, it's going to encapsulate the entire screen, and we're probably going to fade it off at that point. Doing a grid resolution where it's much bigger to encapsulate the entire environment, have the particles fire out really quickly, fill screen. To do it that speed, we're going to need to simulate probably 4 times per frame. We're going to need a bigger grid, so it's going to end up being like 1,000 or 1,200 by 1,200. Like, all these things end up happening, and that's fine when it's required, but when it's just going to be a quick thing, what makes more sense is to do a sim contained and then keyframe that stuff to happen, and that way we can sync it up with the timing of everything else, and everything falls into place. What will happen otherwise is the simulation times are much slower. Getting the timing right, because I feel like that to me is the most critical part of all these effects, is that they all need to match the right timing, okay? And without that, nothing will work. There's already effects elements that I intended to make, and I started building. They look really cool, but they didn't feel right in the shot. I had lightning, actually like a really cool lightning system I built for this shot where I had lightning bolts shooting out. If they hit the ground, they would then crawl on the ground and fork out. Just doing a lot of really cool stuff with all of this, but it is overcomplicated it all, and most of it you didn't see, so it's a matter of being efficient, dumbing it down, knowing when to dumb stuff down. And for me to get the timing right, when suddenly I'm dealing with a high-res grid and everything's slower, it's going to take me multiple iterations to get that timing correct. And on top of that, each iteration will take longer because they're much higher res sims. So it's one of those things that it would require so much more work to not really get much, if any, result. So again, I really want to emphasize like where to put your time and attention. And for me, like I have that conversation so many times with clients where it's like, yes, I can go and create this like really over the top element, and I'm all keen to do that, but in the end of the day, it's going to be this much work, and it's probably not going to be very visible. Or we can use that time to make all the other things where your eye is focused on 10 times better. You know, so it's all about using your time more efficiently to get the biggest bang for your buck. And for me, all the stuff that's sitting on screen, blowing around, like all the stuff building up is really critical. But then after that, it's going to be about like having all the spark particles, things like that that we're about to build now. That to me is really practical as well. So that's my whole spiel, but I think that it's one that I just see it so much when I supervise other artists that I wanted to bring it up and to bring attention to figure out the best solution, the most practical one rather than the most complicated one. Because I, again, supervise artists where I come by and I'm like, hey, you need to create some sparks. Where are your sparks? And they're like, well, I haven't made them yet, but I made a tool that makes sparks. What do you think of this? And it's like, well, we needed some sparks for one shot. Like, we don't need a tool, and we still don't have sparks, and it's 2 days. You know what I mean? So, again, I feel like effects people get allured into whatever the most complicated way is. It must be the coolest way because you can brag about it instead of looking at what the solution is to get the shot done and out the door and onto the next shot, so you can get 100 done instead of making one shot really cool and complex. So anyway, the last thing I'll add on to that would be like Black Panther. I just watched that the other day, and that's a good example where it has loads of effects, and the effects look good. I don't think the effects are very expensive. If you look at it, and this is by no means me saying that the effects aren't good, but I'm saying that if you watch like Infinity War, you see these really over-the-top effects that you can tell a lot of people and a lot of work went into. And I feel like Black Panther, I feel like maybe the budget wasn't there, and the effects look great, but they serve their purpose. They're not something that needs to be over the top and overly complicated. In most cases, like they are an effect, they get built, they do their thing, and then it goes on to the next shot. It doesn't need to be something really robust and have 100 revisions to get that effect. Once it looks great, move on, you know. So again, I think it's the best way to approach everything with effects is to think that way and to think smart about how you're doing your stuff, because smart doesn't mean things aren't going to be cool. Anyway, so that's my big rant, but I wanted to kind of convey that because I'm hoping that 2-minute thing could be something that hopefully will some of you change your outlook a little bit and maybe start to, like, you know, that little gold nugget be the thing that makes you completely change how you work and work 10 times better. Okay, so end of my rant. I'm gonna select these 2 grids, choose clone as a copy, and that will duplicate them. And make sure we're in Shockwave. Okay, so we've got these now. Going back into Shockwave. Sorry, I don't know why that didn't keep. Okay, apparently I already. Okay. Sorry, I already have a lights layer. I'm just gonna put that there and get rid of this layer. I totally didn't see that. Okay, so with the duplicates, I'm just gonna rename these to, we could just call this air shock and then render. Okay, and change the same thing here, air shock. It's the same thing, ground shock render. So by doing that, it just means that we now have these two grids, and they are the ones that actually are going to get rendered. Now, what I want to do next is I want these to scale up as well. However, I don't want these to scale the same way that the master sphere is, okay? So this is where we're going to break away a little bit from that, because the master sphere kind of like pulses and grows over time. I want this to be that one burst, that one beat. So with Shockwave still there, I'm going to go and click sphere and align it to the center. Now, the whole point of this is that I just want to get my two grids and link these to that sphere. Now with the sphere, I want to go to frame 120, right click on the slider to set a keyframe, and then let's wait for this autosave. 155, 156, something like that. I'm gonna hit scale, auto key, and scale this about 80%. So all I've done is I'm just scaling this up, but I'm doing it in one fashion. It's exactly at 120 when the effect happens. We'll now see, if I just enable one of these, show on viewport, the expansion, it's going to hit the camera very quickly. So within, I'd say like 25 frames, like 1 second, it's already hit the camera. So that's what we're going for, just accelerating the effect by parenting it. Having the original one, if we need the resim anything, we just go back to our original grid, okay? Sorry, here. But these are the rendered ones. So these are ones that we're not going to be simulating, but it reads the cache, and then we parent it, we can move it around, we can scale it, we can do whatever we want. And that's a more practical way to do something like this. So it's going to turn the viewport off, but that will work really well. So with that sphere, I'm just going to call this Shockwave Fume Master Sphere, something like that. Just so it's obvious what it is. Now, we don't need them anymore, but what I want to do now, and I think this is the really critical piece, is I want to focus on creating the particle elements, because we have this big shockwave hit and encapsulate the camera, the environment, everything, and it's serving its purpose there. But the second part of this, which will still be rendered with it all, is I want to have all this kind of like ember, spark, ash kind of stuff flickering and fluttering around the screen or the scene to kind of help kind of give it this ethereal feel. So I'm going to hide that stuff for a while, and I'm just going to focus on creating an emitter object, just something radial, very similar to what we've had before. Okay, so I'm just going to go into my shockwave here, and in fact, let's get the master sphere. Sorry, I take that back. Let's get the volume sphere. I just want to see what these guys are parented to again. Now with scripting, this is the lazy person's way of figuring out what that is. So volume sphere rot. So volume sphere rotation. So effects controls. So with this guy, I like the fact that this is shooting out. That's not it. It's the master sphere. So I like the fact that this is shooting out as rotating. And that's kind of what I want to do here. Initially, I'm going to build a cylinder. And the idea is I just want this cylinder to be parented to it. So that way it kind of twists and it does its thing. So I'm just going to simply go cylinder. Make sure we're in the shockwave. Drag this out. Just make sure it's above ground. Alright, so the height, I think around 322. I think that's roughly what I was going for. Just something where it's not too big. And I'm just going to center this. I'm aligning it to the center of the particle system. Just something. I think that'll be good. Raise it up in the air. Height segments we don't really need. I'm going to put this up to... let's try 72. Let's give it a lot of segments. And... actually might scale this down. Just make it a bit smaller, because initially I want these to be concentrated and shoot out. The main thing is, if we go to Edit Mesh, I need to click the top, delete, click the bottom, delete. Just make sure there's no faces. So what we actually have is just a ring with no cap or anything, okay? So once I've got that, I'm going to parent it to this object, and let's just turn all that off, so that way now it's going to expand with it. All right, so the main thing is, if I go into my particle system now, I'm going to have that off. I'm just going to create a new particle system. We'll give this a bit of room. I'm going to call it Sparks. It's probably not the most accurate name, but it'll do. PFS Sparks. And with this, I'm just going to create a birth, link this up. I guess around 127 is when everything goes to hell, so we'll set that to 127. 750 particles are going to get created. Just clicking on the PFS Sparks, the top node, as always, set the viewport percent to 100 and max this value out. Now, with the position object, let's just choose the cylinder, so that way it's going to emit on there. The main thing is I'm going to choose lock on emitter. And that way you see these particles are locked on. Now, what's happening is the cylinder is scaling up, it's rotating, it's doing its thing, but it's going through the ground, which we don't want. So the easiest thing to do is, if I go to the cylinder here, I can go to hierarchy over here, and then link info. And here you can see all the inheriting, so all the inheriting effects of its parent. So I'm going to turn all of that off, except for X and Y. So what's going to happen is it's going to inherit the X and Y scale, but it's not going to inherit the rotation, it's not going to inherit anything else. It's just going to scale out. So again, I'm doing this because I want to use the least amount of controllers, because if the director or someone comes back and says, hey, change the timing of this, I don't want to have like all these controllers and then have to fix it all. And trust me, this could be like the day before delivery, you've already, you know, burnt the candle on both ends, you're exhausted, and it's midnight, and you get a request like this, and this is when mistakes begin to happen. You fixed 2 of the 3 nodes, and it wasn't until you do your render, and it's like a 24-hour render, then you realize something's wrong, and you go back and troubleshoot. You want to simplify this as much as possible. So right now I have the cylinder is being driven by the same thing that is expanding with everything else. So like, I'm using 2 or 3 controllers to drive everything, and you know, that way there's minimal amount of mistakes can happen. So now these particles are all moving, they're looking good. Again, just to keep these a bit more distributed better, I'm just going to set this to like 5. This is going to push them to distribute a little bit more evenly. Okay. And I might say delete particles, and that just helps with any ones that are irregular. It shouldn't be in the place that they are. The key thing with this though is I just want to have 2 systems. One's going to be kind of like a darker ash, and the other one's going to be kind of more alive. It's going to be more vibrant, kind of sparks or something. So initially, I'm just going to go and create a spawn. I'm going to do it on the right side here. All I want to do with this is I'm going to make these sweep along the ground. So as they expand out, I'm going to make these snap to the ground surface. Now, rather than using this, we could use the what do we call it? This is where I have to go find it. The collision top and bottom. Okay, there we go. So cold top and cold bottom. So cold bottom here. I'm gonna get my lock bond and choose that surface, because that was the conformed surface that we used earlier. So it's just a simple surface. I'm gonna say to lock and snap to the surface. I won't say restrict, but I'm gonna say I'm gonna do offset limit. And this is gonna push it up. It's going to raise it off the ground a little bit. And the most important thing, I'm getting ahead of myself here, but I'll explain in a moment. Just waiting for this to autosave, is I'm just going to turn the force off on these two here. So I'll link this up, and then I'm really getting ahead of myself. I'll explain. This lock bond is just going to constrict or restrict, sorry, the particles to the ground. So that way they're free to move around, but they're going to be locked essentially to the ground, or they're going to at least snap to the ground and then they can flow away. So that way, even though this cylinder is shooting out as it is, these other particles you see have shot down to the ground, and they're not restricted, so they can move off, but they at least snap to the surface. And then we have that offset, and that just prevents it from being, you know, perfectly on the ground. We're just kind of making these a bit more random. I did 5,000, I'll do 500, that's fine. The force kind of restricts it to the ground, so I'm saying to be completely free, same thing with the spinning, but just to snap to the ground, so that way these are more aligned with the ground. I think that's going to work better. So in addition, I'm going to go to my spawn, and I'm going to do this by travel distance, because this is moving over time, so I'm just going to do that. I'm going to lower the inheritance. I still want it to go in the same direction, but not as fast, but I will completely randomize this. So all that's happening is now we're creating lots of particles that are shooting out as this is moving along. So the cylinder drives them, but these are all coming off of the ground, okay? There are some that are a little bit crazy. I'll need to look into that. Could that be the inheritance? Yeah, that definitely helps. So I don't mind crazy, but it's just good to know where it's coming from. Okay, so hopefully this makes sense. We have particles here. They're spawning new particles. These new particles snap to the ground, and then they're free to roam around. From there, I'm going to send these to a new event, just so that way they're completely free of that lock bond once they've sampled once. And this new one, I want to have it collide with the ground. So I'm going to do another collision. We've got that U deflector, so I'm going to add the bottom to it, link that up, and now we've got particles that are flowing around, but they're also, for the most part, remember what I said before about dumb particles are never going to be perfect. They are going to fall through the ground, but that's totally fine. I'm just trying to get these to move along the surface. So a couple of things I'm going to do here. I'm going to look for a drag. I'm just going to use whatever. Yeah, just drag. And I'm also going to put a wind in. And call this sparks wind. And I'm going to make this radial. We can snap it to the center as we've done before. But I just want to move this down onto the ground so it's not pushing them down. And I'd say let's just give it, at least starting out, like a low strength. I'm going to give it, sorry, I'm going to give it a little bit of turbulence. Frequency of 2, which is kind of my go-to value in 0.1, and add that in. So this is going to push it out a little bit. but it's also going to give it a bit of a turbulent motion. I think the two of them will work well. What we can do is give this a bit of fall off. Okay, if I show range indicators, you can see that that is making that kind of blue line appear, and that's just representing the radius. Now it's not like only inside of there, it's basically saying that that's the core focus, and then it kind of decays from there. So what's happening is the areas further away are not going to get influenced as much, so it's not going to push it out as much. But what I think we can do, I'm going to go back to like 110 for a moment. I wouldn't mind setting a keyframe for some of this stuff and just kind of animating it. So I might go to like frame 117. I'm just going to set a keyframe, so you see I just push it, I have auto key on and put it up and then down. Now obviously it's going to create a keyframe at frame 0, so I just need to go in here and kill that. So selecting the 2 frames at frame 0, kill them. So all I'm doing is I'm setting a keyframe for 117 for those 2 values. Cool. And now what I'll do is, let's just scroll this along about there. I'm going to give this a lot more strength, okay? We want this to now really push it more. It just means that everything that was kind of lagging behind earlier on will just get pushed out more. The main thing is I'm going to make this a lot more turbulent, okay? So just having those 2 values put in, all it's doing is just going to help push everything out. And mostly I'm just animating up the turbulence. So I think overall that should work pretty well. The main thing from here I'd like to do is just start to give this some shape, because I think that is going to make a lot more sense when we can actually start to see this come together. For now, I'm just going to change this to geometry. What I might do, there's actually an asset I've built which we can import in. So rather than using cubes, it might make more sense just to create that instead. So I'm just going to import this in really quick. So you should be able to download this file, and that is just the asset ash. So I'm just going to go import merge and bring in the file asset_ash.max and just choose the group there to bring it in. And it should drop it into our Shockwave. There we go. Cool. So I've actually reset my material editor. So none of our materials are in there, but all I'm going to do, I'm going to just pick the blue spark one, so this guy here, and I'm going to go to the next one. I'm going to use the picker and choose that. And that way we can bring in the shaders from this, and we can actually use them in a moment. So going back into our system, I'm going to go shape instance, and I'm going to pick the instance geometry. Really important, I'm going to say use the group members. So this is actually grouped. It means it's 3 objects grouped together. So I'm going to say group members, meaning that it's going to randomly assign each particle one of these 3 shapes. Now right now they might be a little bit small, but you get the general idea. So keep these in order, by the way. So in other words, collision should always be at the bottom. Scale should be below the shape instance. So that way the scale is applied after. And it's going to bring the scale up. Randomize this a little bit. Really important, I'm going to apply a rotation, and that will randomly orientate these. And then we could do a spin, which will make them spin over time. And the spin, I'll set this to speed space follow. In other words, it's going to be based on the velocity. So as it speeds up or slows down, it'll control how much it spins. And we can set this to spin kind of slower in all axes. So I'm going through this kind of quick, but I mean, this is pretty basic stuff. It's just randomly assigning the orientation, making it spin over time. I use the scale to kind of randomize it all. I'm going to move that deflector to keep it at the bottom. But now what's going to happen is we can see we got all these random pieces moving along, okay? And so they got a little bit of turbulence. They're blowing out towards the camera because we have that wind in the center as well. So it's pretty effective just to give us some kind of interesting motion. What I wouldn't mind doing from there is just adding another spawn. And it's mostly, I like the formation, so I wouldn't mind having them clumped together a bit more. So I'm only going to say like 10% will spawn, and of these, they're going to be like 20% the inheritance, but I'll vary that to 100%. So in other words, all I'm doing is I'm going to say like if there's a particle, it's got a 10% chance that it will create another one, and that one's going to break off and fall behind randomly. Okay, so I like the idea of that because then you have random ones that clump into patterns a little bit, so that way they're all kind of breaking off extra pieces and just kind of gives it a different feel. So finally, I'm just going to assign a material to this. You can use that ash shader, so I'm just going to drag that in here, and that will just give it a dark ash kind of feel. Because I want to generate two different types, I'm going to do another one. It'll be very similar, but this is going to generate one that's more sparks, and these are going to be more in the foreground, they're going to be more airborne, they're going to flutter around more. These will definitely be the center of attention, whereas these ones are more filling in that negative space and giving it contrast by having darker amounts that are still fluttering throughout the scene as well. I think it's really good to kind of have that differentiation between colors. It really mixes it up and gives it less of just a perfect simulated computery feel and just more randomness to it, and all these things together kind of add up over time. Same reason why I'm adding little random spawns and things like that. All of this is chaos to kind of help reinforce that. Okay, so let's duplicate the setup. Link it up. It's the same idea. We want to initially snap it all to the ground. This time we're going to make it a little bit more airborne. So I'll put the spark one, the blue spark in here. It's not blue, I realize that, but we'll throw that in. And more importantly, I'm going to drop in 2 winds. So again, make sure Shockwave is the active one. And we'll make this planar, hold shift. I'll name these in a moment, but we'll set them both to 0. And actually, I might just need one of these. So I'm just going to add this one wind in. And let's just set it to raise up in the air a little bit. More importantly, I'm just going to give it some very similar turbulence to what we've had earlier. Just something that's kind of similar to the Tenderly spheres. It's kind of more of a wider arc. And by adding that in here, we'll call this... what do we want to call it? We want to call it Sparks Big Wind. Okay? And so that's just going to help make this one kind of more raise up in the air. So there's not really that much difference other than I've got an additional wind which kind of pushes it up in the air and into a wider arcs. And so that's going to help make them a little bit more airborne. Okay? And so I'll make these yellow so you can just kind of see them a little bit better, but you can see that these guys are going more airborne. Same as before, we'll make these spawn. I'd say we'll make them spawn more. So we'll do travel distance. We'll just keep it at 1. and we'll vary this, but also vary the spread of them as well. So in other words, we're really encouraging these guys to go a lot more airborne. So these are getting a lot more crazy. Again, I can render these out. I mean, all they look like is basically dark ones and then brighter ones. So I'll render them really quick just to take a look. Atmospherics off, and let's just get that cylinder, make sure it's not renderable. We can hide it even. So we can see here we got the brighter ones. It might be hard to distinguish the darker ones. If you check the alpha, you can see they're there, but obviously on black it's kind of hard to see. What's interesting though is if we go into our material editor, we see there's a 2 on the ash and there's a 1 on that spark material. So if I go into render elements, we can choose some elements to render out. I'm gonna choose to render out a multi-matte, and then we set the is material ID to 1. So what that's doing is saying use the material IDs. We saw 1 and 2. So this multi-matte element is going to spit out material IDs that we can use later on to color correct it if we want to, things like that. What will happen short term is there'll be a chance for us to be able to see the difference between the two. So if I click now, you see there's a multi-matte. If I click that, we can see there's red, which is 1, 2 is green. So red are the airborne ones, and then 2 are the ash that's on the ground. Okay, so that kind of works out well. Yeah, so I mean that's pretty much it. Now we render it with a shockwave, so we would also do a V-Ray atmospheric, and I think that's all we would need to render out here. Obviously turn atmospherics back on and unhide our fume render. Okay, so that way they're there as well, and that's it. Like we can render this out, and just to make it a little less confusing, I'm going to go up and turn the display off on the top node, and that way we don't see that. We just see the particles blowing on the ground. But overall, I think this is going to work out well. It means that we have particles, we have the volume, like the shockwave, we have the air shock, and we have the dark ash, we have the light ash, we have a render material ID for them. And we also have the V-Ray atmosphere, so we can pull the atmospheric out very easily. And at this point, again, I'm just going to render this out. But we're able to plow through this pretty quick because it's very similar setup to what we've already been dealing with. And that's the beauty of this, is that none of this is that different. You know, if we were to even look at our particle systems, they're not all that different. You know, we have spawns generating more spawns, that sort of thing. I mean, there's, you know, all of these setups are kind of the same concepts, just used very differently. And so here, you know, if you can picture it, we now have like the electric pulse effect, we have the fringe, we have the V-Ray volume fog encapsulating everything, we have our air shock and ground shock encapsulating everything once it hits the camera, and then on top of that, we're now going to have like the sparks and embers, like all this stuff kind of fluttering around the screen, kind of making everything very active. Your eyes definitely going to be focusing on them, and just kind of getting some really interesting results from it. So, you know, even here at frame 160, we can see there's a lot now happening. So I'm going to render these out, and we can take a look at the elements. I didn't do as much rendering in between here, just because our fume grids, although we're not intending to keep them as high res as like 1200 by 1200 or anything like that, the two grids together are still quite heavy, and then our particles together are quite heavy. So I mean, doing test renders, I haven't really done too many. I've done more previews just because I know what it's going to look like, but at the same time, like the render times are a little bit steep because they're big grids and everything. So because of that, I'm just trying to keep them down to like doing fume effects previews to understand the motion, and then doing all of our renders at once. But yeah, I'm interested to see how this turns out. But I think that overall, you know, these elements together are going to look really, really cool. Okay, so yeah, and I think this is the last of the effects elements we need to build. We've built a lot. We've done the pulse, the fringe, the V-Ray volume fog for the volume core. We've done now the shockwave and the atmosphere and the air. We've also done the sparks and the ash, like all these different layers to build it all up. So I think this is really, really cool. So I'm going to render this out, we'll check it out, and we'll go from there. So interestingly, this is the raw pass. You know, it looks good. I don't mind it. And this is with a little bit of post-processing. I mean, it's still very work in progress. Obviously with the environment, everything else will look a lot better, but this is going to show the difference between that and this, just pushing the colors, pushing the brights, having the material IDs so you can color correct one over the other. By itself, it looks a bit odd, but when it's massaged in with everything else, it's going to look really rock solid. So I think that this is going to work out really interestingly, just kind of looking at this and all the different, you know, elements that come together on top of the fact that we have all the other ones that tie together. So as is, it's working well. It's something that was a bit, you know, different to what we've been doing so far, but all the elements together are going to make for something really interesting. The next step, the next thing that we're going to be focusing on is going to be building the interactive lighting layers, reflections, just a bit of icing on the cake for everything before we go into comp. And that's where everything really happens. As an effects artist, I think that we all need to learn to composite, because otherwise our effects elements are we're never going to really take full advantage of them. So when we get into comp, that is where we will make this look amazing, and I think that's where the real power is going to be. But I think that a couple of things that could make or break the shot is how well it ties into the environment. Keep in mind that this entire effect is a giant light source, so we can't just have it sit in the environment and do nothing. It's going to look very cheesy. So this needs to be able to illuminate the environment. It needs to reflect in the same areas that the rest of the environment is. There's going to be a lot of stuff that we're going to do to relight the shot in 3D that we can then take into comp. And then finally, when we get into comp, that's where all of this comes together and we get to see some really powerful stuff. I'm excited. I'm really excited about that. Okay, I hope you enjoyed this video. There's another one coming shortly. And in the meantime, I've had a lot of email relating to the mentorship. I'm compiling an FAQ at the moment to send out, which I hope will answer a lot of these questions. The biggest question has been more focused around signing up. So there are limited spaces, and without fail, we always fill up right before the cutoff date, and the registration does close on June 24th, so typically it fills up a lot longer before that. But I will say not to panic, there's still plenty of time, and if you are thinking about signing up, it is better to not wait until the last minute. There have been people in the past who have been prioritized on the waiting list the next year around, because they did wait too long and had to wait an entire year before they could actually get in. But we still have time, so there's no need to panic yet. The other thing that's been brought up is what type of hardware to use. So typically I'll say as long as you have 16 gigabytes of RAM, you can do the course. However, I do recommend at least 24 gigs to really show off what you can do. We are creating real industry production shots, so you need to be able to do them at the same level as in film and in the games industry. But what I will do soon is I'm going to be sending out a new visual effects hardware guide I've recently written, which will hopefully outline a lot of this information more in depth. So I'll send that soon. In the meantime, keep an eye out on your inbox for the next video, which will be coming up shortly.